Kirby and the Forgotten Land was announced a while ago now, but it's still one of the most anticipated games of 2022. It's got a lot riding on its quality, and even more on its commercial success, as the first true 3D entry in the Kirby series. It's not the first time this pink ball of incessant hunger has dabbled in the dimension, though. There's been plenty of other titles to take advantage of the Z-axis, but none that play like a traditional Kirby game. They're all wacky spin-offs that are drastically different from one another, and I thought it'd be fun to give them all a try before this new game comes out. So sit back, relax, and let's see which of these games reigns supreme. First up, we've got a Super Nintendo title that dates back to 1994. Kirby's Dream Course. This game has always been the biggest eyebrow raiser to me, and that starts with its concept, a golf game starring Kirby as the ball. It does far more than put a Kirby skin on your standard golf game, though. It gives the sport a really interesting twist that's adapted to the Kirby universe quite well. It takes the two most fundamental parts of a golf game and throws them out the window. 1, you don't have a club and aim your shots directly from Kirby, and 2, the hole you're aiming for doesn't even exist at the start of each course. Instead, each one has a set amount of enemies placed around, which are killed when you collide with them, and the hole is only revealed once all but one enemy is killed, with that enemy's location becoming the hole. This is such a cool idea, and it adds so much more to the game. Now instead of just aiming for a single hole, you've got to strategize and figure out the most optimal way to wipe everything out and land near the last enemy. But this fantastic premise would be nothing without solid controls and fun gameplay, both of which the game has. You can angle your shot left and right, show more of your path by pressing down, and send Kirby skyward by pressing up. If you hold B while changing your angle, your shot will curve that direction instead, allowing you to better avoid certain obstacles. When you have your best route nice and lined up, press A and select which way you want the ball to spin, if any. And if your shot's going up, you control the backspin or forward spin on the ball by timing out this little meter. Once that's done, you set your power by timing another button press for when this meter is filled up to the amount that makes sense for your desired distance. After that, Kirby's launched forward, but there's still some small things you can do to change where he ends up. If your shot needs a little more juice, you can mash A to give him a little boost, and if you press A as he lands from a drop shot, he'll bounce extra high. And hitting certain enemies allows Kirby to gain their abilities with the press of a button. A little icon will appear in the corner of the screen, and after pressing B, they'll have a crazy effect on your roll. There's a ton of these, and each one has a completely unique effect. The wheelies make you zoom forward until you bump into something, the parasols let you take control of Kirby as he falls and also slow down your forward movement, and the chilies let you freeze water and roll over it as normal ground. This is exactly what I was talking about when I said the game does more than just slap a Kirby coat of paint on an otherwise mundane golf game. Kirby's signature ability is applied to the traditional golf formula in a really interesting way that makes for an incredibly novel experience. That alone makes this a pretty damn good game in my opinion, and everything else I've mentioned only adds to its quality. The only criticism I really have with the game is that it doesn't directly tell you how everything works, but there is a menu option that leads to a slew of tutorials for everything you could possibly want to learn. These videos are super handy, and if they weren't there, it would be a serious issue, but it's still not a great approach. It's pretty lame that you just watch these clips to learn everything, and it's not at all interactive with courses built to teach you different things. And the sheer amount of these helpful shorts makes the game a bit overwhelming at first. I don't want to just sit there for almost a half an hour and watch tutorials just so I can play the game well, but you have to. I only watched a few and skipped the rest at first, and upon revisiting the demo play option, I found out I was doing a ton of things wrong, and watching the clips improved my play drastically. It's not the worst thing in the world, just a bit of a roadblock to the fun part, but in a somewhat complex game, these things need to be taught to the player, and this way of doing it functions, so I'll let it slide. As soon as you get past that, it's a really enjoyable game. I adore all the mechanics and think it's such a fresh and innovative golf video game, even decades later. And there's a fair amount of challenge to it too. You start with a couple lives, each with 4 tomatoes, and after each roll you lose 1 tomato, but hitting an enemy or making it in the hole gives you 1 back, and a hole in 1 gives you a 1 up. When you run out of lives, game over. You've got to restart the set of 8 holes, and this happened to me on my first attempt of nearly every course, so needless to say, it's got some difficulty. If you haven't played this one, I definitely recommend checking it out. It's free with Nintendo Switch Online, and you'll probably have a pretty good time with it. Okay, next up we have Kirby 64 The Crystal Shards, a game with 3D visuals, but only lets you move on a 2-dimensional plane, a 2.5D platformer. I debated whether I should cover this one or not, but I just felt weird leaving it out, since it's the first main series game to star a truly 3D Kirby. I won't be spending a ton of time on it though, because I want this video to focus more on the obscure spin-offs. Releasing toward the end of the N64's life, in March 2000, Kirby 64 had the advantage of its developers at HAL Laboratories being familiar with the system, and as a result, the game looks and runs great. This era is notorious for gross polygonal games, and while this game is clearly far from looking good by today's standards, it holds up far better than most N64 games. And a lot of that is also credited to the control scheme. It's one of the only N64 games to make you play with a D-pad, as opposed to this god-awful analog stick, and that instantly makes it a much easier game to go back and play. So I hadn't tried this one until I decided to make this video, and the only distinguishing thing I knew about it was the ability to combine different Kirby transformations, which, after trying for myself, I realized is criminally underrated. This is such a good idea. It takes Kirby's signature copy ability to the next level, and gives the player a satisfying feeling of discovery when they find a new combination that works. I'll never forget the first time I mixed the lightning ability with the cutter ability and got a full-fledged lightsaber. That was so cool. Now, a lot of the combos aren't very practical, but that's totally fine, because a lot of the fun comes from testing out different combinations, and it's so rewarding to find a new one that kicks ass. It's just a shame it was never really expanded upon in a sequel. I know Star Allies kinda brought it back, but it took away the feeling of discovery, which is what I liked most about it. It just combines the two abilities into something better. It never makes something entirely new that has the potential to be awesome or suck. I'd really like to see it actually taken further in a future game, whether it be the Forgotten Land or a future 2D Kirby game. But even with that aside, I'd still argue the game's worth playing solely for the genuine challenge it offers, as opposed to what modern Kirby games have been able to do. Ever since Kirby's made that grand return to Dreamland on Wii, his games have been notoriously lacking in difficulty. Now, some people like this more casual and chilled out experience and think it fits Kirby pretty well, but I've never been too big on it personally, and that's because of how much potential his copy ability brings to the table. There's so many different things you can do with it, and it makes his moveset one of the most versatile out there, which allows the level design possibilities for the character to be seemingly endless. I just want to see some fresh and tough challenges take advantage of it. I'm not saying Kirby needs to be Dark Souls levels of difficult, I don't want that, but I want something more challenging than what we've been getting recently. A nice middle ground would be great, and of every Kirby game I've played, Kirby 64 gets the closest to that. There's some levels that are actually pretty tough, and they are that way by design, which is all thanks to Kirby's nerfed jump. Instead of being able to float indefinitely, he gets exhausted eventually and plummets to the ground, which forces the player to use every jump wisely. I actually got a couple game overs and had to think through my approach to some sections, and that's a really good change of pace for the series. The only real downside is that it's a pretty short game and only took me a couple hours to beat. Well, that and the fact that the 3D looks so darn immersive and I'm limited to moving in two directions. Seriously, a lot of moments in the game look like you'd be able to move around a bit more, but nope, you're locked to a 2D plane of movement, which is such a tease, especially considering a true 3D Kirby game would take another 22 years to come out. And present day, as we near the end of that 22-year wait, I can't recommend this game enough. It's my favorite traditional Kirby game, and it holds up better than almost every other game on the N64. Most games of the era struggle with awful camera issues that make them feel super dated, but this game's a side-scroller, so it deals with none of those. And even if you play on original hardware, as I said before, you don't have to deal with that funky analog stick, which leaves it a well-preserved experience that's still well worth your time. It's also available to play on Kirby's Dream Collection and the Virtual Console. Let's fast forward 5 months to the next game I'll be discussing, Kirby Tilt and Tumble for the Game Boy Color. I know this doesn't classify as a 3D game, obviously the Game Boy Color can't handle that, but since you navigate a 3D environment, albeit from a top-down perspective, and can move in 360 degrees, we're including it. Plus, it's such a forgotten game and I want to shed some light on it. If you disagree with me including this, no big deal, just skip to the next game, it's timestamped for you. Tilt and Tumble is definitely a very Nintendo game. It takes a gimmick that really shouldn't be the centerpiece of a game and makes it work somehow. The gimmick this time around, an accelerometer, which was built into the cartridge since the Game Boy Color doesn't feature one. This allows the player to roll Kirby around the world by simply tilting their console, hence the namesake. Not sure what the Tumble's referring to though. The added accelerometer not only gives the cartridge a weird shape when compared to other Game Boy Color games, but it also makes it a very difficult game to emulate or even play on anything but the Game Boy Color. Movement in-game is entirely dependent on which direction the accelerometer detects you're moving the cartridge, and therefore the system, but since every later Game Boy has you load the cartridge differently, it misreads your inputs. Well, it reads them correctly, but the cartridge is upside down or backwards. And emulation is obviously more difficult because A, this is the only Game Boy Color game to have this control scheme and therefore no system emulators are super built for it, and B, because even in emulators that recognize tilting as an input, setting it to button presses just isn't the same. So the only way you can get the full experience is by buying a Game Boy Color and this game, and it's pretty expensive, which is why I opted to grab the cheaper Japanese version, the system's region free. Let's get to the game itself. Kirby Tilt and Tumble has you work through multiple short stages trying to reach a goal, but only one button is needed to do that. You tilt the system to move any direction, tilt forward and pull back to shoot Kirby upward, and press A to shoot him from all the different launch pads. It's super simple and it works great. The only issue is with how touchy the motion controls are. It's really tough to move slowly and be precise with this control scheme, as tilting the system just a tiny bit makes it move pretty quickly. This would be totally fine if the areas allowed some leeway with your movements, but no, a lot of them just have narrow paths and small moving platforms you have to stay on, which is super difficult. And it's not the good kind of difficult, it's the come on, I barely tilted the system! Motion controls inherently don't provide players with a ton of precision, and being one of the first games to use it as a way to move your character, it's understandable that it's a little wonky. They're what make the game so fun though. Every stage was designed with this control scheme in mind, and while it does hold back certain sections, I think as a whole they did a good job designing levels for them. They did about as much as they could with the concept. There's red stars to collect in each area that provide additional challenges and plenty of puzzles to solve, none of which are head scratchers, but they're still rewarding to overcome. Some stages even have some obstacles that move when you tilt certain directions, which is really neat, but the stage itself isn't what's moving when you tilt normally, so it doesn't really make much sense. It really diversifies the ways the player can interact with the stage they're working through, and in turn gives them way more complexity, which I'm all for. Besides the main stages though, there's these bonus games that have you do a whole bunch of weird things with motion controls, and you know, I kinda like these. They don't add a ton to the experience as a whole, but since it's the only Game Boy Color game to have an accelerometer, these bonus games gave them the opportunity to test out some wild ideas they have for a similar control scheme, and boy did they have some ideas. Overall, this is a pretty enjoyable little game, but considering how many hoops you need to jump through just to play it, I wouldn't recommend you go out of your way to try it. Next, we've got a game that released in 2003 for the good old GameCube, the only Kirby game for the console in fact, Kirby Air Ride. Now, I've talked GameCube racing games before, but I skipped Air Ride, not because it's a bad game or anything, but just because it's overshadowed by other racing games on the console. F-Zero GX was the last real F-Zero game, Mario Kart Double Dash is such a fresh spin on the Mario Kart formula, and my personal favorite, Sonic Riders, is one of the most strategic and fun racing games out there. That's some pretty steep competition, but this game holds its own incredibly well, and it definitely deserves to be considered among the best racing games of its time. The biggest thing Air Ride has going for it is its simplicity. For the main races, only the analog stick and A button are needed to perform every maneuver, but this doesn't limit the amount of things you can do at all. The stick's pretty self-explanatory, but the A button does a whole slew of different things. If you hold it before a sharp turn, you slow down a bit and can aim yourself in the right direction, then letting go launches you that way, which is a solid solution for drifting. Pressing A when in the air sends you straight to the ground, on these green arrows it gives you a boost, and when near an enemy it allows Kirby to suck them up and gain their ability. This is the game's substitution for items, and it's another example of the developers giving a standard element of a select genre a unique Kirby twist, and I love it. Most of Kirby's most iconic abilities are seamlessly transferred to a racetrack setting, and they make for a really unique item selection. From the needle dudes that essentially turn you into a porcupine, to the wheelies that give you a huge speed increase and great handling, hell, even the standard sword ability isn't something you normally see in a racing game. And when you inhale one of the enemies that don't have a power, it's shot ahead at nearby foes, but isn't that ingenious? Instead of copy-pasting a standard red shell ripoff, they took inspiration from an actual ability in the games and made it work in this racing game scenario. That's awesome. Only problem with the items is that there's no real balancing to them, since the enemies are just kinda thrown around each track. In most racing games, items allow players that are further behind to gain some ground on first place, because they'll get the more powerful and effective ones, while the leaders get crap. This game does the opposite. Those in the front get to grab their preferred ability, while those falling behind are stuck with whatever's left. While it makes it more difficult for newbies, the aforementioned simple control scheme sort of cancels it out, because even someone new to the game can hold their own. This is one of the game's greatest strengths, it being so inviting to newcomers, and for that reason it's one of the best games on the console for multiplayer, and definitely the best racing one. I'd still argue that Sonic Riders is my favorite racing game on the system, but only in single player, because a lot of the game's mechanics are obscured from players and take a while to learn, which means it's tough to find someone to play with. For someone who's played it to death, it's a great time, but for anyone playing with me, yeah, they're already gone. It's such a complex game that doesn't do much of anything to teach people how to play. Not only is Kirby Air Ride a lot easier, but anytime you enter a mode for the first time, these tutorials play and tell you literally everything you need to know. And when you go into options and press movies, they're all right there to rewatch whenever you need. But while it is indeed an easy game to pick up and play, there are some elements that take some getting used to and benefit those with experience. The first of which is something I haven't seen in many other racing games, and it's the fact that going off of ramps provides players with a choice. You can either go back to the ground right after and keep zooming on land, or you can pull your star up and soar through the sky, hence the air in Air Ride. The latter is so much fun to do, it just sucks that it doesn't really allow for any shortcuts. At times it may look like you can skip parts of the track, but attempting to go off course will make you hit an invisible wall and slow down. That does make sense though, because if they didn't do that, the vehicles with better flying abilities would be absolutely broken. And speaking of vehicles, they're definitely the most strategic element of the game. After picking the track, you select your machine, and this decision affects the entire way you can take on each race. Rather than just having different speed, weight, and size stats, they've all got unique gimmicks that make them perform better in different situations. Your standard warp star is the most neutral, it does everything fine. It's your average Joe, and if you don't know the layout of the track you're about to play, you should definitely pick it, because from there,
things get a little hairy.
This machine goes at lightning speeds, but only in straight lines, and to change direction, you have to hold A and come to a complete stop. This machine is slower on the track, but it's crazy fast in the air and can keep you off the ground longer. And this machine doesn't give you a boost after turning, but it's faster than the standard star and has more HP, which I'll explain later. Those just scratch the surface of what's offered, but I think they do a decent job at showing how different your approach to each race has to be with the different machines, since they have such obvious strengths and weaknesses. They don't try to hide this information from the player either. Hovering over any machine will bring up a short but handy description of them. The strategic advantage comes from picking which vehicle will work best for the selected track. If you know it has a lot of straightaways, you'll want to pick the Swerve Star, and if there's a ton of sharp turns, you'll have to stay away from the Slick Star that has no traction. This is actually another way it's kinda similar to Sonic Riders, except here it's the vehicles and there it's the characters. Each track has shortcuts that are only accessible by certain character types, either speed, flying, or power, and if you know a certain type's routes better on a select track, you'll need to pick one of those characters to perform your best. I love that aspect of both of these games. Character/vehicle selection actually has a drastic impact on how you take on each track, and it provides a somewhat different experience with each choice. I do like the shortcut approach in Riders a bit more though, because in Air Ride, there aren't a ton of shortcuts that are limited to certain vehicles. You're mostly picking which one can get you through the main route fastest. That does fit with the more newcomer-friendly gameplay though, because if a more experienced player knew a ton of shortcuts, their friends wouldn't stand a chance, so this way makes it a bit easier on them. But that's enough about the standard Air Ride mode. There's 2 additional modes that provide a decent change of pace from this normal gameplay. The first of which is Top Ride, and if you thought Air Ride was simple,
Get a load of this!
You race on these super small tracks from a top-down perspective, but the racing is stupid simplified, and you can only pick from 2 vehicles. There's the Free Star that turns whenever you move the analog stick, and the Steer Star, which can only spin left and right. I appreciate that they let you pick which control method is more comfortable, but come on, no one's gonna play this for more than 5 minutes. You can still hold A to slow down and drift, but that's about it. Sure, there's a couple new items, and the tracks aren't bad in design by any means, but it's so bland, and I'm not really sure why they included it to begin with. City Trial, on the other hand, might just be the best aspect of this entire game. So, you're thrown into this giant, open-ended world and have 5 minutes to find a machine you want and collect as many stat-improving emblems as you can. These are scattered all across the world, and it's a lot of fun to look around for them. While it's not the most interesting world out there, there's plenty of hidden areas, cool environments, ramps to fly off, and rings to glide through. You can also get these stat-improving items from attacking other players and stealing theirs, which makes things way more hectic, and the stage events that occur only add to this chaos. There's a ton of different things that can happen, and they add a random element to each round that I really like, and if they're capitalized upon properly, they can really help you, and if not, they can screw you over. When time's up, you move on to the stadium and take on a final challenge with your pimped out machine. Some of these contests require extreme precision in the air, others rely solely on ground speed, then there's a few of these battle arena things and some standard races. The type of contest is revealed to the player in the middle of the round, which gives them some time to find the perfect vehicle and collect the best upgrades for the provided situation. And I love all these challenges, they're a lot of fun, and how much they vary from one another keeps it from getting stale on back-to-back rounds, it's great. But what is debatably the best thing about this mode is the free play option, which lets you roam around the world with unlimited time. If you head underground, there's a garage containing every machine in the game, and you can play around with them in this open environment. While you'll want to spend as little time as possible off your machine in the normal city trial, here you've got the luxury of exploring the world as Kirby on foot. This is the first game to let you walk around as Kirby in a 3D world, and while the area is pretty barren without a vehicle to zoom through it on, it's still wild to see Kirby walking around this 3-dimensional city. While he doesn't have most of his usual abilities, he does still have multiple jumps, but regardless, you can tell you weren't intended to do anything here without a machine. That's totally okay though, because the machine riding gameplay is near flawless, and the game that was built around it is one of the best for the system. It's just too bad it was never re-released. While it is not the 3D Kirby game most people asked for at the time, it excels in just about everything it tries to do. And it's without a doubt in my mind, the highest quality Kirby spin-off we've gotten. But after that, we wouldn't see Kirby on home console for another 7 years. And worse, we wouldn't see him in another 3D game for another 13. In 2016, Kirby Planet Robobot released, and packed in with it was this tiny little additional game mode called Kirby 3D Rumble. It's a super short game and takes less than 10 minutes to beat, but it's the most true to form Kirby has been in 3D. No golf balls, no rolling, no strolling through cities, an actual, somewhat faithful Kirby moveset. He can do his usual jump, crouch, and inhale, but there's no way to swallow enemies and gain their abilities, you can only spin them back out. While I wish some staple transformations were thrown in there, it would be a lot of work, and when it's for such a small side game, it makes sense why they wouldn't go through the hassle. What we got is just there to give the player a taste of how Kirby's base moveset would feel in 3D, and that's pretty sweet. Each level is split into multiple small islands, and all you have to do is take out the waves of enemies as they spawn in. It's all timed though, so you're trying to do this as fast as possible, usually by inhaling enemies on one end and spinning them across the stage to wipe out the others. The checker pattern on the ground really does help with aiming your shots, and it's pretty satisfying to hit a string of enemies. Once an island is cleared, you move on to the next one, and so on, until you get to the end and have to take on a boss, which just requires a couple additional hits. I actually enjoyed this last fight though, avoiding his attacks and grabbing the stars that appeared after them to send back was fun and worked surprisingly well in 3D. Overall, it's a nice additional mode that gives you a really good, albeit small, sample of what Kirby can be in 3D. I'm really glad I decided to sit down and give all these games a try, because a lot of them are excellent titles that I wouldn't have really checked out otherwise. Kirby Air Ride is now one of my favorite racing games, and I see myself revisiting it more often than I do most games on the console, if not for the multiplayer alone. And Kirby's Dream Course is pretty awesome too. I always thought it was super strange and just boring looking, but after giving it a fair shot, it's fun and I'd recommend you try it out. While Tilt and Tumble was the most lacking of the spin-offs, it's still not bad, it's just not worth the hassle of playing authentically. Kirby 64 is now my favorite mainline Kirby game that I'm just surprised it took me this long to try. And 3D Rumble just gets me pumped for this new game coming out. I cannot wait for the Forgotten Land release, and if you're just as excited as I am, I'd recommend checking out the game that caught your eye most in this video. It'll really help kill the time, because I know it helped me. And leave your thoughts on any of the games I discussed down below. Have a great day. Kirby out.